Welcome to day 182 on the trail. We have four readings for today from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 1 through 21, 1 Samuel chapter 21 verse 1 through 22-23, Psalms 34, 52, 56, and 142, and 2 Maccabees chapter 11 verses 1 through 12. We begin today in 1 Samuel chapter 21. David and his men escaped to the priest Abimelech in a town called Nov. David is very vague in describing his purpose for visiting Abimelech for obvious reasons. But David and his men are in need of food, and the only bread available are the 12 loaves of bread which were placed in the sanctuary before God. This bread, which was presented to God each Sabbath, was to be eaten by the priest and his sons. Nevertheless, Abimelech gives this bread to David and his men, since they have met the ritual requirements. In the New Testament, Jesus references this incident when his disciples were plucking and eating heads of grain on the Sabbath. In Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 3, he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." After being refreshed with the holy bread, David also asks for weapons. Abimelech offers David the sword of Goliath, which David takes with him. After leaving Nov, David continues his flight from the wrath of Saul. First, he travels to the Philistine city of Gath. It should be pointed out that Gath was the city of Goliath. Now David comes to the city of Goliath carrying the sword of Goliath. However, upon his arrival at the city gate, David is recognized. In response, David pretends to be mad. How he actually escaped from Gath is unclear. However, David writes Psalm 34 based on this experience and emphasizes his trust in God. Psalm 34, beginning in verse 19. "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord rescues them from them all. He keeps all their bones. Not one of them will be broken. Evil brings death to the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned." After departing Gath, David escapes to the cave of Adullam in Judah, where those who were oppressed or opposed Saul attached themselves to David. From there, David travels to a stronghold in Moab. You may recall in our reading from the book of Ruth on day 181 that Ruth is the great-grandmother of David and was a Moabite. Therefore, David has ancestral ties to Moab. Finally, I wanted to note that I have included associated readings from the Psalms which relate to the events contained in today's readings. While 1 Samuel gives us a record of what happened to David, Psalms 34, 52, 56, and 142 provide us with some insights into David's thoughts and how he saw these events within the context of his relationship with God. Turning now to the New Testament and our reading from 2 Corinthians. Here, Paul continues his defense against his opponents. Earlier, Paul responded to his opponents by presenting a list of accomplishments, his training, and persecutions. However, he felt he was being pressed into this argument, and his only true reason for boasting was to show the power of God. As he had written earlier in chapter 10, "Let him who boasts boast in the Lord." To his opponents, Paul demonstrates that boasting of one's accomplishments or position is not a sign of apostleship or authority. In the final analysis, Paul sees boasting as useless, unless it directs all glory and honor toward God alone. Paul continues his argument by referring to a powerful, mysterious, heavenly vision that he had. However, we immediately notice that Paul refers to himself in the third person, saying, "I knew this man," when he's referring to himself. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 2, "I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows." This appears to be Paul's way of showing that Christ's power and purpose is behind these visions and revelations, and should not be attributed to anything that Paul could boast about in himself. Beyond what Paul says here, we do not know when this vision actually took place in the life of Paul, what he actually saw, or where he was when he saw it. However, it does seem that when Paul refers to the third heaven, he indicates that he was taken to the ultimate heaven. As Irenaeus points out, if Paul had only journeyed to number 3, and the Corinthians believed that there were additional, higher heavens, then Paul's revelation would seem to be inadequate. Therefore, in all probability, Paul was telling the Corinthians that, whether in the body or out of it, he was taken to the highest heaven, namely, the third heaven. However, this debate is far from Paul's point, because instead of using this experience to bolster his own authority, he quickly points his readers to simply look at what they know of him. Beginning in chapter 12, verse 6, "But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. But if I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations." Yes, if Paul were to talk about his revelation from God, he would be telling the truth, and therefore not boasting about himself. Yet Paul chooses to remind the Corinthians of what they have seen and heard from him in their own experiences of Paul. Paul himself and his work among the Corinthian Christians themselves should be enough for them to trust Paul, his teaching, and his love for them. Then, in the next few verses, Paul shares with his readers that to ensure that he does not become puffed up with pride in his work or accomplishments, Paul reveals that he was given a thorn in the flesh. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. "Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated." Now there has been no shortage of speculation devoted to identifying the nature of Paul's thorn in the flesh. However, there is actually very little that can be said with any certainty. Jerome believed the thorn was something physical, like a pain in Paul's ear or head. Along this line, some recent commentators believe that this ailment may have been related to Paul's sight, based on Paul's letter to the Galatians. In the closing of that letter, Paul notes that the handwriting is his own, making special reference to the large letters with which he is forced to write. This line of reasoning is then expanded to theorize that Paul's poor eyesight may stem from the scales that fell from Paul's eyes after his conversion experience in the book of Acts. However, this again is pure speculation and has been losing support in recent years. Chrysostom, focusing on the messenger from Satan that Paul mentions, thought that the thorn may have been an adversary, such as one of Paul's opponents, which would fit with the larger context of Paul's discussion over the last few chapters. We will never be able to identify Paul's thorn with any certainty. However, Paul clearly believes that the thorn was a bitter reality that drew him closer to God. Initially, Paul prays 3 times to have this thorn removed, But the Lord responds in verse 9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." Paul then turns this thorn, this weakness, into a strength as he continues in verses 9 and 10. "So I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with my weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." Instead of boasting of his strengths or accomplishments for the sake of the gospel, Paul boasts in his weaknesses, for in them the power of Christ rests upon him. After all, Paul's ministry is not about Paul, but Christ. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.